There is a story about China that everyone tells. You have heard it at dinner parties, in boardrooms, in congressional hearings, and on cable news. It goes like this. China is a rising superpower built on theft, subsidies, and authoritarian control. It copied Western technology, manipulated its currency, and flooded the world with cheap goods manufactured by exploited workers. It became wealthy by cheating, and now it threatens the rules-based international order that made its rise possible. The story concludes with a warning. China's model is unsustainable. Its debt is explosive. Its demographics are collapsing. Its government is brittle. The system will crack, and when it does, the world will return to normal. This story is repeated so often that it has calcified into truth. But I want to suggest something uncomfortable. What if this story, the one that shapes billions of dollars in policy decisions, the one that justifies tariffs and sanctions and military buildups, is not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong? What if the way we talk about China reveals more about our own anxieties, our own historical blind spots, than it does about China itself? I want to take you back to a moment that most people have forgotten. In the year 2000, the United States Congress debated whether to grant China permanent normal trade relations, a prerequisite for China's entry into the World Trade Organization. The debate was fierce. Labor unions warned of job losses. Human rights activists warned of empowering an authoritarian regime. But the proponents of integration made a seductive promise. They said that trade would change China. They said that as China opened its economy, it would inevitably liberalize politically. Markets would create a middle class. The middle class would demand rights. The Communist Party would be forced to loosen its grip. Prosperity and freedom, they insisted, were two sides of the same coin. President Bill Clinton stood before Congress and said, "By joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom." He continued, "When individuals have the power to realize their dreams, they will demand a greater say." This was not just optimism. It was doctrine. It was the assumption baked into decades of Western engagement with China. The assumption that there was only one path to modernity, and that path ran through liberalization, both economic and political. China would become more like us, or it would fail. 25 years later, China has not failed. It has not collapsed. It has not liberalized in the way the West predicted. And this, more than anything else, is what disturbs the Western imagination. Because if China succeeds without becoming a liberal democracy, it shatters the story the West has been telling itself about why it succeeded. For 2 centuries, the West has believed that its prosperity was the result of its values: freedom, rule of law, individual rights, democracy. If China can achieve similar or even superior economic outcomes without those values, then perhaps the West's success had less to do with virtue and more to do with power, geography, and historical accident. This is the crack in the narrative that no one wants to examine. And so instead, we tell ourselves a simpler story. We tell ourselves that China cheated. But let me take you inside that story, because the details matter. When people say China stole technology, what do they mean? They mean that for decades, Western companies voluntarily entered into joint ventures with Chinese partners. They signed contracts. They transferred technology in exchange for access to the largest consumer market on Earth. Was there pressure? Yes. Was there espionage? Undoubtedly. But the core of the exchange was a deal. Western corporations wanted the Chinese market badly enough that they agreed to share their knowledge. They made a bet. They believed that even if their Chinese partners learned to make cars, or chemicals, or semiconductors, The Chinese would never catch up to the cutting edge. They believed that innovation, real innovation, required the freedoms and institutions that only the West possessed. They were wrong. Not because China stole some secret formula, but because they underestimated what happens when you combine a massive, disciplined workforce with a government that treats technological advancement as a matter of survival. When you give a civilization that invented paper, gunpowder, and the compass access to the tools of modernity, and when you create a system that funnels resources toward strategic industries with an intensity that no democratic electorate would tolerate, you get results. But even this is not the full picture. Because the story we tell about China is not just about economics. It is about identity. It is about the unspoken assumption that has governed international relations since the end of World War II. The assumption that the future belongs to the West. That modernity has a single template. That history, in some sense, ended with the triumph of liberal democratic capitalism. When Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history in 1989, he was articulating something that most Western elites already believed. The Cold War was over. The West had won. From this point forward, the world would gradually converge toward the Western model. There might be bumps along the way, but the direction was inevitable. China's rise does not fit this script, and rather than revise the script, the West has chosen to treat China as an aberration, a glitch, a temporary deviation that will correct itself through crisis. This is why every few years, a new book predicts China's imminent collapse. The coming collapse of China, the China bubble, the end of the Chinese dream. These books sell well in the West because they offer reassurance. They tell us that the old story is still true, that our way is still the only way, that we do not need to question ourselves. But while the West writes these books, something else is happening. Go to Southeast Asia, to Africa, to Latin America, and ask people what they see when they look at China. They do not see a country on the brink of collapse. They see a country that built high-speed rail networks, while the United States argued about infrastructure for decades. They see a country that lifted 800 million people out of poverty in a single generation. They see a country that, for all its flaws, delivers results. And when they compare that to the wars, the debt, the political paralysis they see in Washington, they ask themselves a question that makes the West deeply uncomfortable. What if the Chinese model, for all its authoritarianism, actually works better? I want to be clear. I am not here to defend the Chinese system. I am not here to ignore its repression, its surveillance, its erasure of dissent. I am here to ask a different question. Why are we so invested in the story that China must fail? Why do we need that story to be true? Because if we are honest, the answer has less to do with economics or human rights, and more to do with something we rarely admit. It has to do with the fact that for 200 years, the world has been shaped by Western power. And the rise of China represents the first serious challenge to that order from a civilization that is not Western, not white, and not willing to play by rules it had no part in writing. In 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. It was a celebration of progress, of industry, of the triumph of the West. Millions of visitors walked through the White City, a gleaming complex of neoclassical buildings that symbolized the apex of human achievement. And at the edge of the fairgrounds, there was another exhibit. It was called the Midway Plaisance, and it displayed villages from around the world. There were Africans in traditional dress. There were Pacific Islanders. There were Chinese laborers. The message was clear. The world was a hierarchy. The White City represented civilization. The Midway represented the primitive, the backward, the peoples who had not yet arrived. This was not subtle racism. It was the operating logic of the age. And that logic did not disappear. It went underground. It became implicit. It became the unconscious framework through which the West still views the world. When Western analysts look at China today, they see a system that should not work. They see a government that does not allow free elections. They see an economy that mixes state control with private enterprise in ways that violate every rule in the economics textbook. They see a society that does not prioritize individual freedom in the way the West does, and they conclude, consciously or not, that this must be inferior, that it cannot last, that it will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But what if those contradictions are not weaknesses? What if they are features? What if China has built something that doesn't fit into the categories we inherited from the 20th century? What if the future is not a choice between capitalism and socialism, between democracy and autocracy, but something else entirely? Let me take you to a city you have probably never heard of. Hefei. It is the capital of Anhui Province, a landlocked region in eastern China that was, until recently, considered a backwater. In 2008, Hefei's local government made a decision. It wanted to transform the city into a hub for advanced manufacturing. But it did not have the traditional advantages. It was not a coastal city with easy access to ports. It did not have a prestigious university like Beijing or Shanghai. What it had was ambition, and a system that allowed local officials to act like venture capitalists. In 2020, a Chinese electric vehicle company called NIO was on the brink of bankruptcy. It had burned through its cash. Investors had lost faith. The company was weeks away from collapse. And then the Hefei city government stepped in. It invested 70 billion yuan, roughly $1 billion, directly into the company. It became NIO's largest shareholder. Within a year, NIO's stock price exploded. The company survived. More importantly, it brought its supply chain to Hefei. Suddenly, the city had battery manufacturers, software engineers, component suppliers. An entire ecosystem emerged. The Hefei government made a profit on its investment. But more than that, it had transformed the city's economy. Now, imagine trying to do this in the United States. Imagine the mayor of a mid-sized American city deciding to invest $1 billion of public money into a private car company. The lawsuits would be immediate. The political backlash would be ferocious. The ideological opposition to government picking winners would kill the idea before it left the room. But in China, this happens routinely. And it is not because the Chinese government is smarter or more visionary. It is because the system is designed to allow it. Local officials are judged not by how many votes they win, but by how much economic growth they generate. Their careers depend on it. This creates an incentive structure that turns mayors into entrepreneurs, into risk-takers, into people willing to bet public money on the future. It also creates waste, corruption, and spectacular failures. But it produces results that the Western system, for all its virtues, struggles to match. This is what I mean when I say the story we tell about China is wrong. It is not that China is perfect. It is not that the system has no flaws. It is that we are using the wrong lens. We are trying to understand China through categories that were invented to describe the West. State versus market. Capitalism versus socialism. Freedom versus control. These binaries made sense in the 20th century. They do not make sense now. China has created a hybrid. It is a system where the state and the market are not opposites, but partners. Where the Communist Party does not control the economy in the Soviet sense, but steers it, channels it, disciplines it. where private entrepreneurs thrive not despite the state, but in a strange, tense collaboration with it. And this hybrid, for all its inefficiencies, has delivered the most dramatic economic transformation in human history. But here is the deeper question. If China's system works, if it delivers prosperity without liberalizing, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Does it mean that democracy is optional? Does it mean that freedom is a luxury that only rich countries can afford? These are the questions that terrify the West. Because if the answer is yes, then the entire moral architecture of Western foreign policy collapses. We can no longer say that we intervene, that we impose sanctions, that we lecture other countries because we are spreading universal values. We would have to admit that we are simply defending our own power. And that is a truth that is much harder to live with. The story about China that everyone repeats is a story about inevitability. It says that China's rise was built on unsustainable foundations, that its debt will crush it, that its aging population will cripple it, that its lack of freedom will stifle innovation. And therefore, we do not need to change. We do not need to adapt. We just need to wait. But what if we are wrong? What if China does not collapse? What if it stumbles, adjusts, and continues? What if the 21st century does not belong to the West in the way the 20th century did? What happens then? Do we compete? Do we cooperate? Do we contain? Or do we finally admit that the story we have been telling ourselves is not a description of reality, but a defense mechanism? A way to avoid the most uncomfortable question of all. What if we are no longer the center of the world? The year is 1842. A British warship sits in the harbor at Nanking. Inside a cabin, Chinese officials are signing a document. It is called the Treaty of Nanking, and it marks the end of the First Opium War. The terms are humiliating. China must cede Hong Kong to Britain. It must open 5 ports to British trade. It must pay a massive indemnity. And it must accept that British merchants can sell opium to Chinese citizens, even though the Chinese government has declared the drug illegal and devastating to its people. This is not a treaty. It is a surrender. And it is the beginning of what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. For the next 100 years, China will be carved up by foreign powers. The British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Japanese. They will impose unequal treaties. They will control Chinese ports. They will extract wealth and concessions. And the Chinese government, weakened by corruption and internal strife, will be powerless to stop them. Now, I want you to hold that image in your mind. Because when Western analysts today express shock at China's sensitivity about sovereignty, when they call China's foreign policy paranoid or aggressive, when they wonder why China reacts so strongly to perceived slights, they are forgetting this history. Or more accurately, they never learned it in the first place. The Century of Humiliation is not ancient history to the Chinese. It is living memory. It is taught in every school. It is referenced in political speeches. It is the wound that has not healed. And it shapes everything. When China insists on territorial claims in the South China Sea, it is not just about oil or fishing rights. It is about never again allowing foreign powers to dictate terms. When China builds its military, it is not just about power projection. It is about ensuring that no foreign warship will ever again sit in a Chinese harbor and impose its will. When China refuses to accept Western lectures on human rights, it is not just about protecting the Communist Party. It is about rejecting the idea that the West has the moral authority to judge, given what the West did when China was weak. This is the part of the story that gets left out. The part where the West was not the benevolent teacher bringing civilization to the backward East, but the aggressor extracting wealth through violence. And this matters because it explains why the rest of the world does not always see China the way the West does. When Western leaders warn about Chinese imperialism, countries in Africa and Asia hear something different. They hear the country that colonized them warning about the country that never did. They see the irony. They remember who built the railroads in their countries using slave labor and who is building railroads now using loans. The methods are different. The outcomes are debatable. But the historical ledger is clear. Let me take you to another moment. It is 2015. A Chinese economist named Justin Yifu Lin, former chief economist of the World Bank, is giving a lecture. He is asked why China does not simply adopt the Western model wholesale. Why not full democracy? Why not complete privatization? Why not abandon state-owned enterprises and let the market decide everything? Lin pauses. And then he says something that should be obvious but is rarely stated. He says, "Show me a single developing country that became rich by following the Washington Consensus." The Washington Consensus is the name given to the free market reforms that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank prescribed to poor countries for decades. Privatize, deregulate, cut government spending, open your markets, let foreign capital flow freely. This was the gospel, and countries that followed it, countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, saw their economies collapse. They saw inequality explode. They saw their industries gutted by foreign competition before they were strong enough to compete. Russia followed the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. It led to the oligarchs, to poverty, to the rise of Putin. China looked at this and said no. Instead, China followed a different path. It opened gradually. It protected strategic industries. It allowed foreign investment, but on its own terms. It kept state control over key sectors while unleashing entrepreneurship in others. It violated every rule in the economics textbook. And it worked. This is the part that drives Western economists insane, because the theory says it should not work. The theory says that without secure property rights, without an independent judiciary, without free elections, you cannot have sustained growth. The theory says that state-owned enterprises are always inefficient. The theory says that capital controls strangle innovation. But China did all of these things and grew at 10% a year for 3 decades. So either the theory is wrong, or China is a magical exception that proves nothing. Western economists prefer the second explanation, because the first would require them to rethink everything. But let us go deeper, because the question is not just whether China's model works, the question is why it works. And to understand that, you have to understand something that most Western analyses miss. You have to understand that China is not trying to be a nation-state in the Western sense. It is a civilization state. The difference is profound. A nation-state is a modern invention. It emerged in Europe a few centuries ago. It is based on the idea of a people, a territory, a government, and a shared national identity that overrides regional and ethnic differences. The United States is a nation-state. France is a nation-state. These are countries that were, in some sense, invented. China is not invented. It is 5,000 years old. It has survived dynasties, invasions, civil wars, and revolutions. It has a continuity of culture, language, and identity that no Western country can match. And this continuity creates a different relationship between the people and the state. In the West, the state is seen as a necessary evil. It is something we tolerate because we need roads and police and defense. but we assume that the state is always trying to encroach on our freedom, and therefore we must limit it. We must divide its powers. We must check it with elections and courts. The assumption is that the individual comes first, and the state is a tool that serves the individual. In China, the assumption is reversed. The civilization comes first. The individual exists within the civilization. The state is not an external imposition, but the embodiment of the collective. This is not propaganda. This is Confucianism. It is a worldview that has been internalized over millennia, and it means that the legitimacy of the Chinese government does not come from elections. It comes from performance, from delivering stability, prosperity, and continuity. As long as the government does that, it has the mandate of heaven. When it fails, it loses that mandate, and it falls. This has happened many times in Chinese history. Now, you can argue that this system is unjust. You can argue that it does not protect individual rights in the way the Western system does. And you would be right. But you cannot argue that it does not work, because the evidence suggests that for the specific challenges China faces, governing a population of 1.4 billion people with vast regional differences and limited resources, this system has delivered results that the Western system might not have been able to match. Imagine if China had adopted full democracy in 1980. Imagine the regional tensions, the ethnic conflicts, the populist demagogues, the gridlock. Would China have been able to make the hard decisions necessary to build infrastructure, to relocate industries, to control pollution? Or would it have looked like India, a vibrant democracy that has struggled for decades to build basic infrastructure because every project gets tied up in courts, protests, and political bargaining? This is not an argument against democracy. It is an argument for humility. It is a recognition that different systems work for different societies at different times, and the idea that there is one universal model, one correct way to organize human society, is itself a form of arrogance. But the West cannot accept this, because if we accept that China's system works, we lose the moral high ground. We lose the ability to say that our way is the right way. We are forced to compete on results rather than values. And that is a competition the West is no longer confident it can win. Let me take you inside the Chinese internet. If you have never used Chinese social media, you might assume it is a desert of government propaganda. But the reality is far more complex. Weibo, which is similar to Twitter, is full of criticism. People complain about corruption, about pollution, about inequality, about incompetent local officials. The government does censor content, particularly anything that threatens the legitimacy of the Communist Party or calls for organized political action. But within those boundaries, there is a loud, chaotic, and often cynical public discourse. Chinese citizens are not brainwashed automatons. They are sophisticated consumers of information who have learned to read between the lines. They mock official propaganda. They find ways to discuss sensitive topics using coded language. They are, in many ways, more politically savvy than their Western counterparts because they have to be. And here is the part that confuses Westerners. Many of these people, the ones who complain about their government online, also support the system. They want reforms. They want less corruption. They want more accountability. But they do not want revolution. They do not want chaos. They remember the Cultural Revolution. They remember the instability. And they look at the Arab Spring, at the collapse of Libya and Syria, and they think, no, thank you. They have made a trade-off. They have accepted limits on political freedom in exchange for economic opportunity and social stability. You can call this a devil's bargain. You can say they have been conditioned to accept authoritarianism, but you cannot say they are incapable of making choices. And this is what the West gets wrong. The assumption that every Chinese citizen secretly dreams of living in America, that they are waiting for liberation, that they would choose Western-style democracy if given the chance. Some would, many would not, and their reasons are not irrational. Now, let me take you to the edge of the story, because the real question is not whether China's system works today. The question is whether it can adapt to the challenges of tomorrow. And those challenges are immense. The first is demographic. China's population is aging faster than any country in history. The one-child policy, which seemed like a rational response to overpopulation in the 1980s, has created a demographic time bomb. By 2050, China will have more people over 65 than the entire population of the United States. Who will care for them? Who will pay for their pensions? The government has tried to reverse the policy, allowing 2 children, then 3. But it is not working. Young Chinese, particularly women, are choosing not to have children. They are too expensive. Housing is too costly. The pressure is too great. And unlike the West, China does not have the option of importing young workers through immigration. The cultural and political barriers are too high. The second challenge is the middle-income trap. Every country that has grown rich started by making cheap goods. But at some point, wages rise, and you can no longer compete on cost. You have to move up the value chain. You have to start making advanced products that require innovation, not just imitation. Japan did this, South Korea did this, but many countries like Brazil and Mexico got stuck. They grew to a certain level and then stagnated. China is at that inflection point now. Can it make the leap? Can it become a society that innovates rather than copies? The jury is still out. There are signs of success. Chinese companies are leading in electric vehicles, in solar panels, in certain areas of artificial intelligence. But there are also signs of stagnation. The best and brightest still want to send their children to American universities. The cutting-edge research is still happening in the West. China can mobilize resources. It can scale production. But can it create the kind of free-thinking, risk-taking culture that produces breakthroughs? That is the question. The third challenge is legitimacy. As I said, the Communist Party's legitimacy comes from performance. As long as the economy grows, as long as people's lives improve, the government is secure. But what happens when growth slows? What happens when the economy stagnates? When unemployment rises, when the promises of prosperity no longer hold? Does the government crack down harder? Does it whip up nationalism to distract from domestic failures? Does it look for external enemies? These are not hypothetical questions. We are seeing the signs already. The crackdown on tech billionaires, the increased censorship, the more aggressive posture in the South China Sea and toward Taiwan. These are the moves of a government that is worried, not about external threats, but about internal legitimacy. And this brings me to the most dangerous part of the story. Because if China's system is fragile, if it is heading toward a crisis, then the world is heading toward instability. A collapsing China would not be a quiet implosion. It would send shockwaves through the global economy. It would create refugee flows, regional conflicts, and a vacuum of power that other countries would rush to fill. And if China's leaders believe that the system is under threat, they may take desperate measures to preserve it. They may crack down harder at home. They may become more aggressive abroad. They may decide that the only way to unite the country is to rally it against a foreign enemy. This is the nightmare scenario. Not a strong, confident China, but a weak, insecure China lashing out. So the story about China that everyone repeats is not just wrong because it misunderstands how China works. It is dangerous because it blinds us to the real risks. If we keep telling ourselves that China is about to collapse, we will not prepare for the more likely scenario, which is that China muddles through, that it adapts, that it remains a major power with a system that is fundamentally different from ours. And we will not ask the harder question, which is, how do we live in a world where there is more than one model? How do we compete without demonizing? How do we cooperate on shared challenges like climate change while disagreeing on values? These are the questions that matter. But they require us to let go of the story that says the West is the center, that our way is the only way, that history is on our side. That story is comforting, but it is a fairy tale, and the longer we cling to it, the less prepared we will be for the world that is actually emerging.